All right, we'll continue with our discussion of Chapter 2 of Dussel's Philosophy of Liberation. Uh, Themes in this segment, the idea of the project or the proyecto is something that will come back later on in the book that'll be important. His notion of a critical everydayness and some thoughts about the notion of situated freedom. So let's try to cover those through three very quickly in this lecture. Uh, Human beings are futural beings. We're temporal beings of time, and we're oriented towards the future. Also, the past, the present, of course. But even the meaning of the present and the meaning of the past is always TBD. It's always to be determined. It's always what it might be, what it might mean. So we're oriented towards the future. And the word project really means to throw forward. We are projections into the future. And for Dussel, he wants to capitalize on this idea. The Spanish word is proyecto. He says that this refers to our projects in the sense of our plans, our systems for getting what we want. So since we're oriented towards the future, that we are trying to fulfill or actualize certain potentialities that we have, certain capacities that we have, and not others. And we, of course, want that to work out. So we organize our thoughts and our actions, and we organize our views of the surrounding world, including other people, in the light of that proyecto, in the light of that projection into the future. So our projects are, in a way, another kind of horizon on which we and everything else for us shows up and takes their meaning. It refers to this projection in the future, but what gets projected into the future is a function of what has already been. So the projects, our projections into the future, are very much structured and constructed by what has been and where we have found ourselves and what our context has been and what our potentialities are, and in particular, what our capacities are, as we learn that term in Zubiri. So our projects tend to mirror or instantiate or be examples of the overarching system, the overarching world, the overarching referential system of significance in which we are placed and in which we find our place. So what Dussel's concerned with here is that our projects tend to reproduce more of the same, reproduce what has already been produced, because we get in that cycle. This is the way it's been, so this is the way it's going to be. And if the way it's been has generated injustices, then the way it's going to be will continue to generate injustices unless something breaks through, unless we can attain a certain sort of consciousness about our projects and our futural being, the way humans are. If we get some insight into that, something that cracks open this endless cycle of repetition. Now, he wants to talk about this idea of critical everydayness. And he says the everyday way of living, surrounded by products, is not, as the modern thinking of the Kojisho proposes, a theoretical life, a bios theoretikos, as the Greek said, where persons explicitly ask themselves what things are. The first way of confronting products in daily life is to use them within the dynamics of the practical existential life of the everyday, the bios practicos. Now, I'm sure that Dussel is getting this directly from Heidegger, Martin Heidegger. This is straight out of Heidegger's masterwork, Being and Time. You can find it in the first division, chapter 3, section 15, on what he calls equipment or tool being. Philosophy has tended to think that humans are first in this world in a theoretical attitude. Theoria in Greek means to see, to grasp intellectually, to see, to get it, to understand. And Heidegger points out that that doesn't come first. What comes first is we use things. We don't think about them. We don't discuss what they are really. We don't do philosophy on them. We use them. We don't think about our shoes, we're wearing them. You weren't thinking about your shoes until I said shoes just a second ago. The what surrounds us first and foremost are what Heidegger calls tools or equipment. We are in the midst of constantly using things like our computers and in my case, microphones and cameras and PowerPoint slides at the moment. And I'm not thinking about microphones and cameras and PowerPoint slides. I'm thinking about the ideas of Dussel. I'm working. These are all pieces of equipment that I'm not consciously thinking about. I'm not even aware of them unless, as Heidegger says, something breaks. My camera battery runs out or my screen goes blank or something and I have to quit. And then I start looking at the thing. It's like, what is this thing? This is a computer. It's not supposed to have a screen go out. What do I do when the screen goes out? I got to look at it kind of theoretically. All right, how is this supposed to work? What's a computer supposed to be doing? But when it's all working fine, you don't notice. If your shoes, you don't notice unless your shoelace breaks or something. Oh, great, great. Now I got to deal with this. So our primordial encounter with the world around us is in practical use of things. And only when things break, as Heidegger says, when things go wrong, do we stop and consciously become aware of those things and think about those things as things. And when we think about them as things as such, well, that's actually the scientific attitude. When we look at a computer, not for how it helps me try to teach other people about these complicated ideas of Dussel, but as a piece of physical equipment with a certain kind of logic to it. It doesn't matter what it's used for. That's not what's interesting me. I want to know about it outside of the system of meaning. For me, all these pieces of equipment are what they are and mean something to me because I got a project. For instance, I got a project of trying to put some ideas out there for people to ponder and see what they think of. Uh, that's what gives them their meaning. But if I'm a scientist, I'm looking at their chemical compounds or their physical makeup or those kind of things. I'm not interested in where they fit into a system of meaning particularly. So we don't have a theoretical life first. We have a practical life first. We get to theory. We get to science later on. So we live, as Heidegger would say, and Dussel says, in a kind of thoughtlessness. We go about our business doing things. We go about our day accomplishing things, but we're not really thinking about those things for the most part. For the most part. Even the business we're engaged in here of trying to learn a few things, trying to get some new ideas and try to make sense of them, try to figure them out, we're not thinking about the process of that. We're not thinking about how that fits in with everything else. We're just in the midst of doing it. And it is a kind of thoughtlessness. And Dussel writes, the farness, the distance that leaves proximity behind. Remember, proximity for him is that primordial closeness of humans before labeling and categorizing and thinking things out, is lived within attitudes, interpretations, sense things, and products we do not notice because we have already been close to them since we saw the light of day. This not noticing is like an unseen prison, Dussel writes. We see the world through the bars of our cells, and we believe that they are the bars of cells in which others are imprisoned. Get the picture? I'm looking through the bars, and I'm thinking it's their bars. They're my bars. Our life, because it is natural and obvious, is lived in an acritical naivete with very great consequences. Our way of facing beings is conditioned by this everydayness that is our own being, our second nature, our ethos, our cultural and historical character, the totality, the world system in which we find ourselves, does our thinking for us, so to speak. We think about, again, think your own life, how many things you do. And if somebody says, but why do we do all these things? How many of those things we're doing we wouldn't have a really good answer for? Well, we just say because that's what one does, and Heidegger in Being in Time, the first division, chapter 4, section 27, talks about what he calls in German das Mann, which is translated as one or they. And we do things because one does them. We do things the way they say you should. They say you should eat your vegetables. Who are they? It's everybody and nobody. They don't have an office. They don't have an email address. One does things the way one does. And if you were to ever do something different, we say, well, that's not what one does. One does not do that. They say you shouldn't do that. They say you should do that. We live according to this they, this impersonal uh, 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 milieu in which we live that does our deciding for us for the most part. So we go to school because that's what one does, and we get a major because they say it's a good major, and that's what we do. And it's acritical, it's uncritical, a kind of a sleepwalking through life. And Heidegger and Sartre and the existentialists in particular were very much trying to wake us up to try to help us live authentically, where our lives would be actually our own and not theirs, not the they life that we normally live. And Dussel continues, this is the first naivete. Later, there will be other types of naivete. You're unaware of things, correlative to other types of criticism. Thus, everyday persons in Western civilization consider themselves critics of the naivete of the primitive and uncivilized person. Westerners do not view the sun as a god the way the Aztecs or the Egyptians viewed it, or the way the Eskimos and animistic peoples of Africa or Asia still view it. Nevertheless, Westerners naively take for granted that their culture, political power, and military domination are justified, and that they spread democracy and liberty on earth. This mentality is part of a naive everydayness that manipulates whole populations. So what Dussel's going to try to show us, argue for, but show us, get us to see that we might look down on other people as being naive. Oh, they have these naive beliefs, and we sophisticated. We would never think things like that. We've left all that behind, as if now we know. Now we're no longer naive. Now we have clarity, we have certainty. And the certainty with which we live our lives is an uncritical certainty. It's an unthinking certainty, a thoughtless kind of certainty. We just do it because we say things like it is what it is. And that's that. There's no thought behind that, right? There's no critical awareness behind that, but we all do that. And as the existentialists, especially Heidegger, point out, it's very hard to not do that. Heidegger many times says, look, when I point out inauthenticity, I'm not doing ethics. I'm not blaming anybody for doing something wrong. I'm just saying how we do things. We go through life doing what one does. We are socialized. We are constructed beings. The identities we have, we tend to get from the environment, the milieu, which is an impersonal environment of the they. But our certainties are, as it will turn out, a kind of naivete, an everyday naivete. He says scientists, for their part, believe they are not naive. This would be the next step. Well, yeah, the people walking around here, I mean, they don't believe the sun is a god, but they believe that the sun goes around the earth, because they're standing still. At least that's what it seems like. It looks like the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. They're so naive, the regular people. We scientists, we know that that's not really what's going on. We're no longer naive. The earth is rotating on its axis and revolving around the sun, and that's what makes it look like that. Okay, so scientists, for their part, believe they're not naive because they can discover what the person on the street does not know. But scientists of the center, as we shall see later, forget that the very principles of their science contain cultural elements, scientifically indemonstrable, and that all their endeavors serve the non-scientific proyecto and historical culture of the system wherein they live. Scientism, the current ideology of the center, is a subtle ideology, which, although less naive than the everydayness of the hypoli, the many, the people, is more dangerous inasmuch as it fabricates the instruments necessary for the power of the center to be exercised over the periphery. At the proper moment, we shall have to question the naivete with respect to the system as a totality of scientists and discover a critique that is more critical, with regard to the everydayness of the general populace than is the scientific one. So you got the quote unquote primitive people, and they have their naivete, but we Western moderns go, oh well, they're just being naive. Our ways of freedom and democracy, that's just, it is what it is. That's what it's really all about. The scientist comes in and says, wait a minute, you even you people don't really know what's going on. Science will tell you what's going on. Science has the answers to all of these questions, and anything that can't be answered by science is a kind of naivete. But Dussel's going to say, look, there's a naivete in science too. It thinks it's just getting the facts and nothing but the facts. But the word fact, like you can find in the word manufacture, you probably learned that word means literally made by hand. Facts are not found, they're made. That's not to say you could just get rid of them whenever you want because they're made. It takes a lot of work to make them. It does. A lot of effort goes into it. We shouldn't play around with the facts. It took a lot of work to get to them. Just winging it with this idea of alternate facts is ludicrous. But nevertheless, the facts that we've made through hard work have been made at the service of our collective proyecto, our collective world system of meaning. Our lenses or horizon or context of being, which names things and tells you what counts and what doesn't count. So, for instance, science, trying to figure out what's going on in our context, almost always means technology, and a technology used to reinforce the status quo and those who benefit from the status quo. So, we need a more critical critique, Dussel wants to argue. So the progressive discovery of the liberation philosophers, this, to summarize, the naivety of the peripheral people, that's overcome by the naivety of what we call common sense of the center. Everybody knows that, critical everydayness, and that's overcome by modern science. And science at this stage thinks that it has now finally overcome ideology, which for Dussel, is always a negative thing. It's always hiding something. Well, science breaks through. It's no longer hiding anything. But he's saying that is an ideology. So it is hiding something. It's scientism, the idea that the tools and techniques, wonderful they are, of modern mathematical science, answers every question and determines everything. Well, that plays into the hands of the status quo and the political and economic system we find ourselves in. So as we get further in here, we will find some more critical criticism to come. Now, just before we get off this, I just want to say this modern idea, where modern science comes from that idea of Descartes' dualism. Descartes, remember, he wanted certainty. Epistemology was first philosophy for him. He wanted to know what he could be absolutely clear and distinct in his mind about, and therefore certain and indubitable knowledge, the foundation of everything. If I could just find something I'm sure about. And he says, look, even if there's an evil demon who's powerful enough and cunning enough to make me think everything is wrong, everything I think is wrong, makes me believe only wrong things. The one thing I can't doubt, he says, is that I'm thinking, that I'm a thinking thing. I can be wrong about being French or being male or being a philosopher or a geometer or a mercenary, whatever. I can be wrong about all that stuff. But what I can't be wrong about is I'm some kind of thinking thing. And all the thoughts I have seem to come in a kind of dimensionality, parts outside of parts. So if I have an experience of a coffee cup, let's say, maybe that's because there's a coffee cup, or maybe I'm just remembering one, or maybe I'm asleep and dreaming, or maybe there's some evil demon that's just making me think coffee cups when there's no such thing as a coffee cup. Doesn't matter. The coffee cup experience has a top, a bottom, a left, and a right. If it doesn't, there's no experience at all. And he calls that extension. And he says, we ourselves are dualistic. We're two substantial things at once. We're a mind, which is invisible, unextended, unnatural, he even says. And then there's a body, which has a top, a bottom, a left, and a right, extension that's publicly available and visible to all who would like to investigate it. We can study your brain together, but we can't study your thoughts unless you share them, and we wouldn't even know if what you're sharing is really what you think. We can't open up the top of your head and look in and see thoughts. We could just see brain matter and neurons and things like that. So what Descartes' quest for certainty did was like, I got it. I have certainty. If you use the techniques of publicly available mathematical science, that counts as rationality. That counts as reason with a capital R. And if you stick to that, you will get certainties. But the price to be paid for that was carving off all these other aspects of human existence, uh, and calling them mere, saying they're just mere opinion. You can't prove that. You can't prove whether it's right or wrong to do something. You can't prove which religion is the right religion. You can't prove which music's the right music. You can't prove whether a painting is beautiful or not. You can't prove whether this pizza tastes better than that pizza. None of that is open to truth. It's all opinion. Truth is what you get through mathematical physical sciences. Uh, and 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 the scientists who buy into this completely are not doing science. They're doing a kind of philosophy that you could call scientism. Scientism is the idea that whatever science can figure out is the only thing worth figuring out, and if science can't figure it out, it really doesn't matter. It really isn't. That's scientism. Scientism will answer every question. But you can't prove that. You can't do an experiment to show that experiments prove everything. Think about it. Right? Scientism is not a science. It's a view. It's an ideology. And scientism is naive about that fact that it's an ideology, that it's a kind of philosophy, a kind of way of looking at things. All right. So that brings us to the third piece of this particular talk, the idea of situated freedom. He writes in section 2392, openness to the duty of continually determining oneself for this or that possibility, this being sometimes disconcerted and not knowing which to choose, this power itself to choose and not to choose, this capacity or dominion over mediations. That's what I mean by freedom. Picking, choosing, but always in a context. Things and beings that constitute one's surroundings are mediations and possibilities. What is this device in front of me? It's a possibility for something. It's a possibility to use to learn. It's a possibility to use to do artwork. It's a possibility to play games. It's a possibility to go shopping. It's a possibility to forget myself and to get lost in a virtual world. What is it? It's a set of potencies, some of which I will actualize and some of which I will not. That's my freedom. Remember what Zubiri says about being a relative absolute. As an absolute, I'm not determined. It's not foreordained or fated what I will do or what I will choose. I have to choose, but I have to. I'm not completely absolute, able to stand back even from my own self. That's thrust upon me. I have to make myself among things and other people, as an agent and an actor and an author, as he puts it. I'm a relative absolute. Or think about what John Caputo says about not knowing who we are. In an essay entitled Against Principles, he writes the following: my distrust of principles, which would determine what we're supposed to do, my distrust of principles arises from a certain non-knowing, which on my accounting is precisely what gives rise to the passion in our lives. This unprincipled unknowing is not a defect, and I'm not complaining. I would not have it any other way. It has to do rather with the most affirmative open-endedness of our being. For our being lies in being possible. As I put it, our being is may being, in the possibility of all the diverse possibilities of which we are capable, in the possibility of the endless reinvention of ourselves, all of which goes hand in hand with a crucial, structural, constitutive inability to say who we are. You could trace this all the way back to St. Augustine in the Confessions. Quaestio mihi facta sum, he writes, I have become a great question to myself. But I am the question mark. I am what I might be. I can't say for sure what I am because there's tomorrow. And I don't know what tomorrow is going to bring. It's structural. It's not a failing on my part that I don't know who I am. That's the kind of being I am, the being who can't say definitively once and for all, I am what I am. That's it. Right? It's constitutive of what it means to be human. And Caputo talks about a promotion of what he calls heteromorphism, the idea that there's many different ways to be human. You can't settle it once and for all. You can't have one single frame, one single context, one single horizon that puts the definitive label on each thing, as in Dussel's model. That there's too many different ways to be. Dussel writes, persons realize themselves by chosen determinations. The choice of one possibility makes others impossible. By decision after decision, persons construct their own biography, their own history. Right? That's Zubiri. That's right out of that idea of making ourselves, making our I as agent, actor, and author. It's not like there's an I who's doing the making, right? Zubiri says, think of I not as the subject of the sentence, but as the predicate. Think of it as something that's being constructed by you in every moment of your life as agent, actor, and author in a context, in a world, in a system of meaning and significance, where each thing is what it is with reference to everything else, what Zubiri would call respectivity. And that world is a world. It's not the world, it's a world. It's a world that has been constructed, whether we like it or not, and we find ourselves in it. And that world gives us our labels, gives us our place in which we, yeah, have to make ourselves, but it only gives us some possibilities and not other. We have freedom, but it's situated in a certain place. And maybe that place is near the center, and maybe that place is near the periphery. That makes a difference. So we are relatively absolute, just like Zubiri says. To choose freely does not mean being able to determine mediations absolutely from an absolute indetermination. Uh, you can't just choose any old thing you want. You could try it. You could say, I choose today to be a ballet dancer. You could say that, but a lot would have to go into that. You could say, well, it's not logically impossible for me to be a ballet dancer, but remember what Zubiri says about possibilities. That's sort of a logical understanding of that term, but he talks about capacities. You may very well lack the capacity to be a ballet dancer. Uh, he said that, if you could do that, that would be infinite radical freedom, as Zubir would say, absolutely absolute, or God. Nor is a person totally determined or conditioned. That would be simply an animal simulated by unrestrainable instinctive motives. So we're not absolutely free where we can just snap our fingers and do whatever, but we're not strictly determined where it doesn't matter what you think you're thinking or think you're choosing. You're really not, you're just fated to be whatever. He rejects both of those. Persons are free and at the same time historically determined. That is, conditioning is not absolute, but relative or partial. That's the gap where something new can break through. That's the place where we learn that we could step back from the world system in which we find ourselves, the world system that determines who's at the center and who's at the periphery, and who's been oppressed and repressed as a threat to the center. We can step back from that and take a stance towards that and possibly do something. It will show up. It does register, uh, but it registers as an epiphany where something just breaks through and takes a hold of us that we didn't expect and couldn't plan for, and shakes up our nice, easy understanding of who we are, breaks us out of our everyday naivete. All right, let's take a breath or two and we'll come back to it soon enough.